This is the story of a streetcar line that has been rolling through New Orleans for nearly 2 centuries, connecting what were once two separate cities and surviving everything from mule power to Hurricane Katrina. The St. Charles streetcar line isn't just the oldest continuously operating streetcar line in the world. It's a living piece of American history that still carries over 3 million passengers a year through the heart of one of America's most unique cities, from downtown New Orleans to what was once the independent resort city of Carrollton. When you step aboard one of those dark green cars with their mahogany trim, you are not just taking public transportation. You are riding in vehicles that were built between 1923 and 1924, when Calvin Coolidge was president and radio was the newest technology. These Pearly Thomas streetcars have faithfully served New Orleans for over a century, and they show no signs of stopping. Remarkably, one Ford, Bacon, and Davis car from 1894 still exists for track maintenance work, making the fleet's historical span even more impressive. But this story begins much earlier, in 1831, when visionary planners first conceived of connecting New Orleans to the distant suburb of Carrollton. Back then, Carrollton wasn't just another neighborhood, it was an entirely separate city, a resort town that seemed impossibly far from the bustling port of New Orleans. The areas in between were mostly undeveloped swampland and scattered plantations. Planning took 2 years, and in February 1833, work began on what was then called the New Orleans and Carrollton Railroad. This wasn't just any railroad, it was the second railway in Greater New Orleans. When passenger service finally began on September 26, 1835, it was something revolutionary. This was one of the first passenger railroads in the entire United States. Those early passengers paid 25 cents for their ride, which might not sound like much until you realize that translates to over $7 in today's money. For that premium price, they experienced something remarkable, a steam-powered journey through what would become one of America's most famous neighborhoods. The original service was unlike anything we would recognize today. Steam locomotives belched smoke and clanked along public streets without any dedicated right-of-way. Imagine the chaos, the noise, the sheer audacity of running a full-size train down what are now busy city streets. New Orleans residents quickly grew tired of the constant racket, and by 1867 the steam engines were replaced with something more civilized, mules. Yes, mules. For over 25 years the St. Charles line was powered by good old-fashioned animal labor. Teams of mules pulled the streetcars along their route, and while it was quieter than steam, it was certainly slower. But this was progress in 1867, and New Orleans residents seemed content with their mule-powered transit system. The real revolution came in the 1880s. In 1884, during the World Cotton Centennial World's Fair, New Orleans conducted its first experiments with electric-powered streetcars. The technology was brand new, almost magical to people who had never seen electricity used for transportation. But it took nearly a decade to make the transition. On February 1st, 1893, the St. Charles line was finally electrified, joining the modern age of urban transportation. The man behind the streetcars that still run today was Perley Thomas, born in Ontario, Canada, who became one of America's most important streetcar manufacturers. He learned his trade in Detroit and later became chief engineer at the Coleman Car Company in Cleveland. In 1916, he founded his own company in High Point, North Carolina, called Perley Thomas Car Works. Thomas was more than just a businessman. He was an engineer and designer who understood that streetcars needed to be both functional and beautiful. His cars featured high ceilings, elegant wooden trim, and a capacity for 52 passengers. Each streetcar weighed 21 tons and was powered by two 65-horsepower General Electric motors. In 1922, the New Orleans Public Service Incorporated took over the line and placed an order for 73 new Pearly Thomas cars. The timing could not have been more dramatic. In September 1922, after 25 cars had been delivered to New Orleans, a fire destroyed the High Point factory, causing $225,000 in damage and destroying 14 streetcars under construction. But Thomas was determined to fulfill his contract. He secured $100,000 from New Orleans to acquire the necessary parts and rebuild his operation. The remaining cars were completed by 1924, and they cost about $15,000 each, which would be roughly $4 million today. These were not just utilitarian vehicles, they were works of craftsmanship, with mahogany trim, brass fittings, and a level of detail that reflected the pride of both their maker and their city. The St. Charles line became more than transportation. It became part of New Orleans culture. In the 1940s, a young playwright named Tennessee Williams was living in an apartment on Toulouse Street in the French Quarter, riding the city's streetcar system daily. He was inspired by the evocative names of the streetcar lines: Desire, Cemetery, Elysian Fields. When Williams wrote his masterpiece, A Streetcar Named Desire, later brought to Broadway and film by director Elia Kazan, he created one of the most famous stage directions in theater history. They told me to take a streetcar named Desire, transfer to one called Cemeteries, and ride 6 blocks and get off at Elysian Fields. The route was allegorical, but it was also real. New Orleans' colorful street names, including the actual Elysian Fields Avenue that runs through the city, captured something essential about the city's relationship with mortality, longing, and beauty. Williams understood that these weren't just place names, they were poetry carved into the urban landscape. By the 1950s and the 1960s, streetcars across America were disappearing, replaced by buses and automobiles. New Orleans followed this trend with most of its lines. The Claiborne and Napoleon lines were converted to buses in 1953. The Canal Line, which had been a major artery, was converted in 1964. City planners and transportation officials argued that buses were more flexible, cheaper to maintain, and better suited to modern traffic patterns. But the St. Charles line survived, largely because of preservationists who understood its unique historical value. In 1973, these advocates achieved a major victory when the St. Charles line was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The celebration at Gallier Hall drew dignitaries from across the city, including Tennessee Williams himself. Preservationist Martha Robinson, who remembered when mules pulled the cars, said she felt pretty good about the designation. The listing didn't just recognize the streetcars themselves, it acknowledged the entire corridor as a crucial piece of American urban history. This was one of the first times a still operating transportation system had been granted such protection, setting a precedent for heritage preservation in active infrastructure. In 1983, New Orleans created the Regional Transit Authority to oversee all public transportation in the city. The RTA inherited not just the St. Charles line, but the responsibility of maintaining century-old streetcars in daily service. Between 1988 and 1992, the authority undertook a massive $47 million renovation, completely rebuilding all the 35 streetcars and the Carrollton Maintenance Facility. The renovation was more than just mechanical, it was an act of urban archaeology. Each streetcar was stripped down to its frame, every component examined and either restored or replaced with period-appropriate materials. The brass fittings were repolished, the mahogany trim carefully refinished, and the electrical systems updated while maintaining the car's historical authenticity. During this period, the line continued to attract tourists and locals alike. Before Hurricane Katrina, it carried 3 million passengers a year, including countless Mardi Gras revelers who used the streetcar as their preferred way to navigate the chaos of carnival season. The 24-hour service meant that even late-night partygoers could rely on the green cars to carry them safely through the city. Then came August 2005, and Hurricane Katrina changed everything. The storm surge and flooding that devastated much of New Orleans also brought the St. Charles line to a complete halt. But remarkably, all 35 historic Pearly Thomas cars survived the hurricane unharmed, safely stored in elevated facilities that protected them from the floodwaters. The restoration process became a symbol of New Orleans' broader recovery efforts. On December 19, 2006, more than a year after the storm, service was restored from Canal Street to Lee Circle. Mayor Ray Nagin was there for the ceremony, declaring that the St. Charles line is part of the fabric and the rhythm of the city. City Council President Jackie Clarkson added that the restoration sends a message to the world that says we really are back in business. The The restoration continued in phases. Service reached Napoleon Avenue in November 2007, extended to Carrollton Avenue in December 2007, and finally reached its full route along Carrollton Avenue to Claiborne Avenue on June 22, 2008. The entire post-Katrina restoration cost $14.02 million and took nearly 3 years, but it represented something priceless, the return of a beloved institution. Operator Clarence Glover, with 25 years on the St. Charles Line, was chosen to drive the first post-Katrina run. He pulled out a pine green car built in 1922, filled it with his first passengers in over a year, and said that it felt great, like he had been away from home for a long time, and now he was back. For many New Orleans residents, Glover's words captured exactly how they felt about their city's recovery. In 2014, the National Park Service designated the St. Charles Line as a National Historic Landmark. It joined the San Francisco cable car system as one of only 2 moving streetcar National Historic Landmarks in the United States. The designation recognized the line's exceptional value and quality in illustrating or interpreting the heritage of the United States. But the 21st century brought new challenges, particularly around accessibility. The historic Pearly Thomas cars, beautiful as they are, were built in an era before wheelchair accessibility was considered. Unlike modern transit vehicles, these cars could not be modified to include wheelchair lifts without destroying their historic integrity. In 2017, following a federal lawsuit over compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the RTA entered into a consent decree agreeing to make 6 stops accessible and to add at least 1 wheelchair lift-equipped car to the line. By December 1, 2020, accessible service finally began, though it required a delicate balance between preserving history and serving all residents. Today, the St. Charles Line faces both opportunities and challenges. In 2024, the Federal Transit Administration awarded the RTA $5.05 million to construct additional accessible platforms as part of an ongoing effort to make the system more inclusive. The authority also approved a $1.02 million streetcar modernization master plan designed to improve travel times, enhance safety, and ensure universal accessibility. Statistics tell the story of a line that remains vital to New Orleans life. The streetcar makes up to 300 trips per day, covering its 6-mile route in about 45 minutes. Current ridership stands at over 3 million passengers annually, or about 10,400 per weekday. Adults pay $1.25 per ride, while day passes are $3. But numbers do not capture the emotional connection between New Orleans and its streetcars. Student Genevieve Fontenot said it best: "You never realize how special it is until it is gone." The restoration after Katrina proved that New Orleans could not imagine itself without the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the gentle sway of the cars, and the satisfying ding of the operator's bell. The St. Charles streetcar line operates in a world of contradictions. Its average speed of 6.6 miles per hour makes it one of the slowest transit systems in America, yet passengers seem to cherish this unhurried pace. The operating costs are higher than modern alternatives, yet the economic value as a tourist attraction and cultural symbol far exceeds pure transportation economics. Walking along St. Charles Avenue today, you can see why the streetcar has endured. The route passes through some of New Orleans' most beautiful neighborhoods, past magnificent mansions and ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The neutral ground, that uniquely New Orleans term for what other cities call a median strip, provides a dedicated right-of-way that separates the streetcar from automobile traffic. The line carries commuters to work, students to school, and tourists to attractions, but it also serves a deeper purpose. In a city that has faced repeated challenges, hurricanes, economic downturns, social upheaval, the St. Charles streetcar represents continuity. It connects modern New Orleans to its past, while carrying it confidently into the future. As we look ahead, the St. Charles Line faces questions that every historic institution must confront. How do you preserve the past while meeting present needs? How do you balance authenticity with accessibility? How do you maintain century-old technology in a digital world? The answers lie in understanding that the St. Charles streetcar is more than just transportation. It is a moving monument to human ingenuity, urban planning, and the power of communities to preserve what they value most. For nearly 2 centuries, it has carried millions of passengers through the heart of New Orleans, and with proper stewardship, it will continue rolling for centuries to come. The green cars with their mahogany trim continue their eternal journey along St. Charles Avenue, carrying not just passengers, but the dreams, memories, and hopes of a city that refuses to let its history disappear into the past. They are the oldest streetcars in the world, and they are also among the most vital, proving that sometimes the best way forward is to honor where you have been.